The conference room stretched across the 15th floor like a glass cathedral walls of windows, catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it across the mahogany table in broken rectangles of gold. Three people sat on one side, their silhouettes sharp against the Cleveland skyline paperwork arranged before them, with the precision of people who measured their days in billable hours and quarterly reports. The door opened. A man stepped through, and for a moment the light caught him in a way that made him look like he was still walking out of smoke. His suit was charcoal gray, clearly purchased from a thrift store, the fabric slightly too stiff at the shoulders, where the previous owner had been broader. But it was the bandage that drew the eye-white gauze wrapped around both forearms visible just beneath the cuffs of his shirt, where the sleeves rode up as he moved. The woman in the center of the table looked up from the resume in her hands. Her pen dropped. It clattered against the mahogany with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden silence, rolling twice before settling into stillness. Her face had gone pale beneath carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the bruise spreading across her forehead, a purple bloom partially concealed by foundation, and the strategic fall of her hair. The man stopped walking. Their eyes met across 12 feet of polished wood and recirculated air, and something passed between them that the other two people in the room couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't understand. It was the look of two people who had shared something that existed outside of conference rooms and job interviews and the ordinary machinery of professional life. 12 hours earlier, Harry Thompson had carried this woman through a wall of fire. He had not known her name, had not known she wore blazers that cost more than his monthly rent, or that she held a corner office on this very floor. He had known only one thing: she was going to die, and he could not stand there and watch it happen. What he had not known, what he could not have known, was that the stranger whose life he had saved was the same woman who would sit in judgment of his future. The man from Human Resources cleared his throat, unaware of the current running beneath the surface of the room. His name was Robert Walsh, and he had conducted over 300 interviews in his career, and he had never seen a candidate stop a vice president mid-breath simply by walking through a door. But to understand what happened in that conference room, to understand why a woman who had built her career on composure suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost, the story needed to go back further. Back to the night before, when Harry Thompson sat alone in a kitchen that smelled of cold coffee and overdue bills, and a woman named Serena Mitchell fell asleep with a text message she could not bring herself to send. The apartment occupied the third floor of a building that had been new sometime during the Reagan administration. Now it wore its age in water stains on the ceiling and radiators that clanked like prisoners rattling their chains. The kitchen was small, barely large enough for a table and two chairs, but Harry had made it work for 15 years. He sat alone at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold 2 hours ago. The overhead light buzzed with the particular frequency of a bulb about to die, casting everything in a slightly yellow glow that made the bills spread across the table look even more dire than they were. $847 for rent stamped overdue in red ink that looked almost cheerful in its aggression. $312 for electricity. $89 for the phone that Alice needed for school. The numbers swam together in Harry's exhausted vision, forming a mathematics of desperation that never quite balanced. On the counter, his phone displayed a banking app with a balance of $1,247.33. He had done the calculations 6 times already. After rent and utilities and groceries and the gas bill he had been putting off since October, he would have approximately $62 to last until his next paycheck. Unless. His eyes drifted to the suit hanging on the back of the bedroom door, visible through the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the rest of the apartment. Charcoal gray, purchased from the Salvation Army 3 years ago for $89. He had worn it exactly once on the worst day of his life, standing beside a casket that held everything he had ever wanted and watching it disappear into the earth. The suit still fit. He had tried it on that afternoon, standing before the bathroom mirror with his arms raised, checking for moth holes, for stains, for any evidence of the grief that had soaked into the fabric along with the rain from that November day. It looked fine. It looked like a suit. It looked like the kind of thing a man wore when he was trying to convince strangers that he was worth taking a chance on. The interview was scheduled for 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Safety director position at Morrison Construction, one of the largest commercial builders in the Midwest. Salary of $87,000 a year, plus benefits. Health insurance, dental, a 401k with company matching, a desk, no more fires. Harry lifted the coffee mug to his lips, grimaced at the cold bitterness, and set it back down without drinking. 18 years he had worn the uniform of the Cleveland Fire Department. 18 years of 3 in the morning calls and smoke that coated your lungs like wet cement, and the particular kind of fear that came from running toward the thing that everyone else was running from. 127 rescues, 3 commendations from the mayor, a photograph in the plane dealer after the warehouse fire on East 55th that had made him briefly and uncomfortably something close to famous, and then the beam. He didn't like to think about the beam, but it thought about him constantly, the memory lodged in his chest like a splinter that had worked its way too deep to remove. 2 years ago, a residential fire in Tremont, a Victorian that had been converted into apartments. The floor had given way without warning, and Harry had dropped 12 feet into a basement full of smoke and flame and the particular darkness that exists at the center of a dying building. The beam had caught him across the back, pinning him to the concrete while the fire crept closer. He had lain there for 11 minutes before his crew found him. 11 minutes of breathing smoke and feeling his lungs fill with something that one wasn't quite air. 11 minutes of thinking about Alice and wondering if this was how it ended. It hadn't ended. Not then. But the doctors had been clear in the way doctors are clear when they want you to understand the gravity of what they're saying without actually using words like death or dying, or you may not survive the next one. The scar tissue in his bronchial passages would never fully heal. His lung capacity had been reduced by 23%. Every breath he took now was a negotiation between what his body needed and what his body could provide, and the terms of that negotiation got worse with each year. If he stayed on active duty, if he kept running into burning buildings, he would die. Maybe not the next fire, maybe not even the one after that, but eventually, inevitably, his lungs would encounter more than they could handle, and Harry Thompson would become one more name on a memorial wall, one more folded flag presented to a family member, one more promise broken. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him look up, soft, hesitant, the particular cadence of someone who wasn't sure if they should be awake. A moment later, Alice appeared in the kitchen doorway, her sleep-mussed hair falling across her face, her school notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. 14 years old, and she had her mother's eyes. Every time Harry looked at his daughter, he saw Grace looking back at him, and the ache in his chest never quite went away. It had been 3 years since the funeral, 3 years since he had stood in the rain in that thrift store suit and watched them lower his wife into the ground, and still he sometimes turned, expecting to see her standing at the stove, or sitting in her chair by the window, or walking through a door with that smile that had always made everything else seem manageable. Alice crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him, her bare feet tucking up beneath her on the chair. She was wearing the oversized t-shirt she used as pajamas, a faded Cleveland Cavaliers logo barely visible across the front, and she looked younger than 14, smaller, more fragile than the girl who argued about homework and rolled her eyes at his jokes and had somehow become the center of everything that mattered in Harry's shrinking world. The question came without preamble because Alice had never been one for preamble. "You can't sleep either." Harry shook his head, a small gesture that felt like an admission of something larger. The silence stretched between them comfortable, in the way that only silence between people who truly know each other can be comfortable, filled with all the things that didn't need to be said. Alice's eyes drifted to the suit visible through the bedroom door. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, measured like someone picking their way across ice that might or might not hold their weight. "The interview's tomorrow. 2 o'clock, safety director position, Morrison Construction." A pause, then desk job. Harry nodded. "No more fires." Another nod, and this time Harry saw something shift in his daughter's face, some tension releasing from around her eyes that he hadn't even realized was there. She had been carrying this weight too, he understood. Carrying it in the way she flinched every time his phone rang at odd hours, in the way she watched the news coverage of fires with a particular intensity, in the way she had started sleeping with her door open so she could hear when he came home. Alice's gaze dropped to the table, to the bills, spread across its surface, to the mathematics of survival that defined their lives. She picked at a loose thread on her notebook cover, a nervous habit that Grace used to scold her for that Harry had never had the heart to correct. "Dad," Her voice cracked on the single syllable, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if she had been the kind of girl who cried easily. She wasn't. She was her father's daughter in that way, holding everything inside until it had nowhere left to go. I need you to promise me. Harry knew what she was asking. Knew it, the way he knew the sound of his own heartbeat, the way he knew the weight of a fire hose in his hands, the way he knew that the love he felt for this girl was the only thing that had kept him breathing through the worst years of his life. The words came slowly, each one measured and weighed. I promise I'll do everything I can to come home to you every night. That's why I'm doing this. It wasn't the promise she wanted. She wanted absolute certainties, guarantees that the universe did not offer, and that Harry had learned painfully never to make. But it was the only promise he could give, honestly, and Alice knew him well enough to hear the love beneath the careful phrasing. She uncurled from her chair and walked around the table, and for a moment she was 8 years old again, climbing into his lap after a nightmare, seeking the safety that only a parent's arms can provide. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck and held on, and Harry closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of her shampoo and felt something in his chest release that had been clenched tight for longer than he could remember. Grace had been gone for 3 years, 8 months from diagnosis to funeral, the cancer moving through her body with a speed that had seemed almost malicious, as if it knew it had limited time to destroy everything Harry loved. He had worn that suit once to bury his wife. Tomorrow he hoped it would carry him into a new life. Alice's voice was muffled against his shoulder, barely a whisper. You're going to get this job. I can feel it. Then she pulled back, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture that was so much like her mother that Harry's heart clenched and disappeared down the hallway to her room. He heard her door close softly, and then he was alone again with the cold coffee and the overdue bills and the suit hanging in the darkness, like a promise waiting to be kept. Across the city, in an apartment that cost more per month than Harry made in 3, a woman named Serena Mitchell sat on a leather sofa that she had never had time to break in. The walls around her were white and bare, the furniture modern and impersonal, chosen by a decorator whose name she had already forgotten. This was not a home. This was a place where she slept between shifts, a way station in a life that had somehow become all transit and no destination. Her laptop was open on the cushion beside her, displaying a spreadsheet of construction timelines and budget projections that she had been staring at for the past 3 hours without actually seeing. The Morrison Plaza project was 6 weeks behind schedule and 12% over budget, and somewhere in those numbers was her responsibility, her failure, her inability to make reality conform to the neat lines of a project plan. But it wasn't the spreadsheet that kept her awake at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It was the phone lying face down on the coffee table, its screen dark, its silence more oppressive than any sound. Serena Mitchell was 41 years old. She had a corner office on the 15th floor of a building that bore her company's name. She made $340,000 a year, plus bonuses that had allowed her to buy a house that she never visited and a car that sat in a parking garage gathering dust. By any external measure, she was a success. She had achieved everything she had set out to achieve and more. So why did she feel like she was dying by inches, one missed phone call at a time? Her phone buzzed and Serena's hand moved toward it before she could stop herself. The screen lit up with a text message, and the name displayed there made something twist in her chest. Miles, her son, 12 years old, living with his father 40 minutes away, growing up without her in all the ways that mattered. The message was simple, the kind of simple that only a child can achieve. Mom, are you coming this weekend? Serena's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She began to type, I'll be there. I promise, what? The cursor blinked. The words sat there waiting to be sent, and she could already feel the weight of them, the way they would land in her son's hands, the hope they would create, the disappointment that would follow when she inevitably had to break that promise, because something at work came up. Something always came up. She deleted the message. Tried again. I'll try my best, sweetheart. That was worse. Cowardly. An admission of failure before the failure had even occurred. Delete. The cursor blinked on an empty field, waiting for words that Serena could not find. Her son had learned at 12 years old to ask questions he expected disappointment from. That was her legacy. That was what she had built with all her late nights and working weekends and missed birthdays. She set the phone face down on the table and turned back to her laptop, pulling up the folder of candidate resumes for tomorrow's interviews. Safety director position, a role that had become necessary after the incident at the Riverside site in September. Nobody had died, but it had been close enough that the board had mandated a full review of safety protocols and the creation of a dedicated position to oversee compliance. Most of the candidates were what she expected in engineers with graduate degrees, safety consultants with impressive certifications, corporate climbers who had never stood closer to a fire than the barbecue in their backyard. Good on paper, qualified, forgettable. One name caught her attention. Harry Thompson, 18 years with the Cleveland Fire Department. No college degree, but the list of his field experience stretched across 2 pages, incident after incident, rescue after rescue, a career spent running toward the things that everyone else ran from. Serena made a mental note to pay attention to that one. Then she closed the laptop and looked at her phone again, at the dark screen that held her son's question like an accusation. She told herself she would send a message in the morning. She told herself that once the Morrison Plaza project was finished, everything would be different. She would take time off. She would spend real weekends with Miles. She would become the mother she had always meant to be, the mother she had somehow failed to become while she was busy becoming everything else. The exhaustion hit her all at once, a wave that had been building for years finally breaking against the shore of her resistance. Her eyes grew heavy. Her head fell back against the cushion. She fell asleep with her phone still displaying her son's message, the response still unsent, the promise still unmade. She did not know that in 6 hours she would wake up choking on smoke. She did not know that a stranger would carry her through fire and give her a second chance that she had not earned. She did not know that by this time tomorrow, she would be sitting in a conference room across from that same stranger, holding his future in her hands while he held her past in his memory. All she knew in that last moment before sleep claimed her was that she was tired. So tired of running. So tired of always having somewhere else to be. The morning came gray and cold, the February sky pressing down on Cleveland like a wet blanket. Harry woke at 4:30 without an alarm, his internal clock refusing to let him rest any longer, and moved through the apartment in darkness. He showered and dressed in jeans and an old sweatshirt, saving the suit for the afternoon, and stood for a long moment in Alice's doorway watching his daughter sleep. She was curled on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, and in the dim light filtering through her curtains, she looked impossibly young. Harry felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of responsibility that came with being the only thing standing between his daughter and a world that did not care about her dreams or her fears or her desperate need for stability. He left a note on the kitchen table. Went for a drive. Back soon. Love, Dad. The early morning drives had become a ritual in the months since his injury, a way of clearing his head and reconnecting with a city that he had spent 18 years protecting. Cleveland was different before dawn, quieter, more honest. The streets were empty except for delivery trucks and night shift workers heading home, and the skyline rose against the lightning sky like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Harry drove without destination, letting instinct guide him through familiar neighborhoods. Past the school where Alice had just started 9th grade, the building dark and silent, waiting for the chaos of another day. Past the hospital where Grace had spent her final weeks, the parking lot already filling with the cars of nurses and doctors who worked hours that made his own seem reasonable. Past the fire station on East 22nd Street, where he had spent 18 years of his life, where his locker still held his spare uniform and his name still sat on the duty roster waiting for a return that might never come. The road took him down Ashford Street, a neighborhood of converted apartment buildings and small businesses that had seen better decades. He had responded to a kitchen fire here once years ago, a grease fire that had gotten out of control and filled a building with smoke. Nobody had been seriously hurt, but Harry remembered the face of the elderly woman he had carried down 4 flights of stairs, the way she had clutched his arm and called him son and thanked him in a language he didn't recognize but understood perfectly. This was why he did it. This was what made the fear and the damage and the certain knowledge of his own mortality worthwhile. The chance to be there when someone needed him. The chance to make a difference in a world that so often felt indifferent. He was about to turn onto the highway when he saw the smoke. Black and thick, it rose from a building on the corner like a living thing coiling and writhing against the gray morning sky. Orange flames licked at the edges of a 4th-floor window, and even from 100 yards away, Harry could see that this was bad. This was very bad. He pulled the car to the curb and got out, his body already shifting into a mode that 18 years of training had made automatic. People were streaming from the building's entrance, coughing and crying, some barefoot, some still in their nightclothes. A woman clutched a small dog to her chest. An elderly man leaned against a parked car, struggling to breathe. Sirens in the distance, but far away. 4 minutes at least, maybe 5. Harry looked up at the 4th floor. The smoke was thicker now, billowing out in angry waves, and then he saw her. A woman at the window, her face a mask of terror, her mouth open in a scream that barely reached the street. She was pounding on the glass, trying to break through, but the smoke was pulling her back, swallowing her, and even as Harry watched, she began to disappear. The fear hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, turning his legs to water. He was not on duty. He had no gear. His lungs were already damaged, the scar tissue from the beam, a constant reminder that he was operating on borrowed time, borrowed air, borrowed luck that could run out at any moment. The interview was in 8 hours. If he got hurt now, if he damaged his lungs any further, everything he had worked for would be gone. The job, the salary, the future, and Alice. God, Alice. She had already lost her mother. If Harry died in that building, she would be alone. 14 years old with no one left in the world, no one to help her with homework or drive her to school or hold her when she cried. She would have to bury her father the same way she had buried her mother, would have to stand in the rain and watch another casket disappear into the ground. Harry stood frozen on the sidewalk, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, he did not know what he would do. The woman at the window was gone now. The smoke had swallowed her completely. He thought about driving away. He thought about the promise he had made to Alice. He thought about the kind of man he would become if he let a stranger die while he stood there and watched. He thought about what he would tell his daughter, how he would look her in the eyes and explain that he had chosen his own safety over someone else's life, how he would live with that choice day after day, knowing what it had cost. Sometimes the decisions that define us don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like falling. Harry started running. The lobby was already thick with smoke when he pushed through the front doors, the air hot and heavy and hard to breathe. People shoved past him, desperate to escape, their faces streaked with tears and soot. An elderly man stumbled and fell, and Harry hauled him to his feet and pointed him toward the exit without breaking stride. The main stairwell was impassable. Even from 10 feet away, Harry could feel the heat radiating through the fire door, could see the orange glow leaking through the cracks around the frame. He turned and ran toward the back of the building, searching for another way up. The fire escape. He found the access door near the rear exit, rusted and neglected, but still functional. His shoulder slammed into the metal once, twice, and on the third hit the hinges, screamed in protest, and gave way. Cold morning air hit his face as he stepped onto the metal platform. The fire escape clung to the side of the building like a skeleton, rust eating through the bolts, the railings shaking with every step. Harry didn't let himself think about whether it would hold. He just climbed. By the 2nd floor, his lungs were already burning. The smoke was thinner out here, but his damaged airways couldn't tell the difference. Each breath felt like inhaling glass, sharp and wrong, a reminder of everything the doctors had told him about what would happen if he pushed himself too hard. He kept climbing, 3rd floor, 4th floor. The window to the hallway was already shattered, smoke pouring out in thick black waves. Harry pulled off his sweatshirt and looked around, spotted a bottle of water that someone had dropped on the landing. He soaked the fabric and pressed it against his nose and mouth, then climbed through the broken window. The hallway was a tunnel of darkness and heat, the smoke so thick that Harry couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. He dropped to his hands and knees, staying below the worst of it, and began to crawl. 15-second intervals. Hold for 15, exhale, inhale for 3, hold again. Kept breathing, they called it at the academy. A technique for minimizing smoke intake when you had no other choice. Most firefighters never mastered it. Harry had practiced it for 18 years. The carpet was hot beneath his palms. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the crackle and roar of flames consuming everything in their path. The apartment numbers on the doors were barely visible through the smoke, but Harry counted as he crawled, tracking his progress toward the unit where he had seen the woman. The door was open. He pulled himself through and found her lying on the floor near the sofa, unconscious. Her body curled in on itself as if she had been trying to make herself small enough to escape. Her face was pale beneath a layer of soot, and for one terrible moment Harry thought he was too late. Then he saw her chest rise, a shallow breath that was barely enough to sustain life, and something in him unclenched. She was still alive, but she wouldn't be for long. Harry grabbed her shoulder and shook hard. "Hey! Hey!" Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, swimming with the confusion of someone who had already begun to slip away. A cough racked her body, violent and deep, and for a moment Harry was sure she wouldn't be able to move at all. But then her hand closed around his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, and her lips moved around words that barely qualified as sound. "My son, I never sent the message. My son." Harry didn't understand what she meant, but there was no time to ask. "We're getting out of here. Right now." He pulled her arm over his shoulder and lifted her to her feet. She was heavier than she looked, or maybe he was weaker than he wanted to admit. Either way, they stumbled together toward the door, toward the smoke-filled corridor, toward whatever chance of survival still existed. As they moved, Harry noticed things that would only make sense later. The window in the apartment had been shattered from the inside, glass littering the floor beneath the frame. A wet towel lay crumpled by the sofa, a phone clutched in the woman's other hand, the screen cracked but still glowing with a failed 911 call. She hadn't been waiting to die. She had been fighting. The corridor was worse than before. The fire had spread while Harry was inside the apartment, and now flames blocked the path to the window he had climbed through. The only other option was the main hallway, which led to the central stairwell that had been impassable from below. Harry made the calculation in his head. The stairwell had been blocked at the lobby level, but maybe higher up it was still clear. Maybe they could reach the roof. Maybe the fire department would arrive in time to rescue them from above. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only one he had. "Hold on to me," he told the woman. "Don't let go." They moved together down the corridor, Harry half carrying her, the smoke so thick he could barely see his own hands. His eyes streamed with tears. His lungs screamed for clean air. Every instinct told him to stop, to lie down, to give up. Alice. Think about Alice. The corridor turned, and suddenly they were facing a wall of fire. Flames crawled up the walls and across the ceiling, blocking the path completely. The heat was unbearable, pressing against Harry like a physical force, pushing him back even as his mind pushed forward. There was no way through. Harry looked back the way they had come. The fire escape was still there, but the flames had spread to that end of the hallway too. They were trapped between two infernos with no way out. The woman sagged against him, her legs giving out. Harry lowered her to the floor and crouched beside her, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. This was it. This was how he would die. The thought came with a strange calm, almost peaceful. He had known this moment would come eventually. Every firefighter did. You walked into burning buildings often enough, and sooner or later one of them wouldn't let you walk out. But Alice would wake up and find his note on the kitchen table. She would wait for him to come home. And he never would. She would have to bury her father the way she had buried her mother, and this time, there would be no one left to hold her. Something broke inside Harry. Not his body, but something deeper. The will to keep fighting. He slumped against the wall, closed his eyes, and then he heard it. A phone ringing, muffled but clear, cutting through the roar of the flames like a voice from another world. Harry opened his eyes and looked at the woman beside him. The phone in her hand was glowing its cracked screen, displaying an incoming call. The name on the display read Miles. Her son. Her son was calling. Harry stared at that name for a long moment, feeling something shift inside him that he couldn't quite name. He thought about Alice, probably awake by now, probably starting to worry because her father hadn't come home. He thought about this woman's son calling his mother in the early morning, not knowing that she might never answer. He thought about all the children who would be left behind if he gave up now. Harry put the phone back in the woman's pocket and stood up. The corridor to the fire escape was still burning, but the flames were lower on one side, the fire having consumed most of the fuel in that section. If he moved fast enough, if he stayed low, he might be able to get through. It would hurt. It would probably leave scars, but it was possible. He shook the woman's shoulder. "Hey, I need you to wake up. We're getting out of here." Her eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "I can't. Your son is calling you." Harry's voice was steady, more steady than he felt. "You're going to answer that call. You're going to see him again. Do you understand?" Something shifted in her expression. a spark of will fighting its way through the haze of smoke and exhaustion. She nodded. Harry pulled her up again, and this time she held on tighter. He wrapped his arms around her and faced the wall of flames that blocked their path to the fire escape. Don't breathe. Close your eyes. Don't let go. Then he ran, 3 seconds through the flames, 3 seconds that stretched into forever, that compressed all the fear and pain and desperate hope of a lifetime into a handful of heartbeats. Harry felt the heat sear his arms through the fabric of his shirt, felt his skin blister beneath the cotton. The woman screamed against his chest, but she didn't let go, and he didn't stop. And then they were through. The fire escape was still standing, the metal hot beneath his feet, but solid, the railings groaning but holding. Harry didn't trust his legs to carry them down properly, so he half slid, half fell from platform to platform, the woman clinging to him like he was the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to smoke and flame. Second floor, first floor, ground. His legs gave out the moment they touched concrete. Harry collapsed onto the pavement, the woman falling beside him. Both of them gasping for breath that wouldn't come, their lungs full of smoke and pain, and the particular exhaustion that comes from brushing against death and somehow slipping past. Sirens closed now, red and blue lights flashing against the building walls. Firefighters in full gear running toward them, shouting orders, pulling them away from the burning structure. Someone pressed an oxygen mask against Harry's face. Cool, clean air flooded his lungs, and for a moment all he could do was breathe. In and out. In and out. Still alive. Against all odds, against all reason, still alive. He turned his head and saw the woman being loaded onto a stretcher. Her eyes were closed, but her chest was rising and falling. She was alive too. Harry let his head fall back against the pavement. The sky above was turning pink with dawn, and somewhere in the distance, birds were singing. He had done it. But as the adrenaline faded, the pain came rushing in. His arms were on fire, the skin blistered and raw beneath what remained of his shirt. His lungs felt like they had been scraped with sandpaper. Every part of his body screamed in protest. A paramedic leaned over him, her face creased with concern. Sir, we need to get you to the hospital. Can you tell me your name? Harry's voice came out as a rasp, barely recognizable. Harry Thompson. Okay, Harry, you're going to be okay. Just stay with me. He wanted to tell her about Alice, wanted to ask someone to call his daughter to let her know he was alive, but the words wouldn't come. The world was fading at the edges, darkness creeping in from all sides. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was a firefighter's voice, sharp with recognition. Wait, I know this guy. He's one of ours. He's a firefighter. Then everything went black. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, the particular sterile non-smell of institutions that exist to fight death and don't have time for ambiance. Harry woke to the sound of monitors beeping and the weight of bandages on both arms, white gauze wrapping from his wrists to his elbows. The clock on the wall read 2:47 p.m. The interview, the tree, his entire future. He tried to sit up, but pain lanced through his body like electricity, and he fell back against the pillows. The movement triggered an alarm on one of the monitors, and within seconds, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Thompson, you need to stay still. You have second-degree burns on both arms and significant smoke inhalation damage. The doctor will be in shortly. Her voice was professional, caring in the detached way that hospital staff learn to be, caring when they see too much suffering to let it touch them anymore. Harry heard the words, understood them, filed them away as relevant information. Then he asked the only question that mattered. My daughter. Did anyone call my daughter? The nurse's expression softened. There's a young woman in the waiting room. She's been here for about 2 hours. Alice, relief washed through Harry, followed immediately by something sharper. She had found out that her father had broken his promise, that he had run into another burning building, that he had nearly died again. She would be terrified. She would be angry. She had every right to be both. The nurse left, and Harry lay alone in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and thinking about all the ways this day had gone wrong. The interview was supposed to have started 47 minutes ago. By now, they had probably moved on to the next candidate. The job, the salary, the future he had promised his daughter, all of it, slipping away because he couldn't walk past a burning building without running inside. Was that who he was? Was that all he would ever be? The door opened again, and this time it wasn't a nurse standing in the doorway. Alice looked smaller than she had that morning, diminished somehow by the harsh fluorescent lights and the institutional surroundings. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. She stood at the threshold of the room as if she wasn't sure whether to come in or turn around and leave. They looked at each other for a long moment. Father and daughter, the only family either of them had left. When Alice spoke, her voice was very quiet, but it carried a weight that made the silence around it seem fragile. You promised. Harry felt something crack in his chest. I know. You promised me. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Alice didn't move. Her hands were clenched at her sides, trembling, with something that might have been anger or fear or grief or all three tangled together so tightly that she couldn't tell them apart. You could have died. The words came out broken, jagged, as if she had been holding them back for hours and could no longer contain them. You could have died and I would have been alone. I already lost Mom. I can't do that again, Dad. I can't. She was crying now, but not the way children cry. Not the helpless tears of someone who doesn't understand what's happening. These were the tears of someone who understood perfectly, who had already lived through the worst thing that could happen, and now had to face the possibility of living through it again. Harry raised his hand, ignoring the pain that shot through his arm, the protest of damaged skin and tired muscles. Come here, Alice, please. She hesitated, stood there in the doorway with the fluorescent lights behind her and the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her shoulders. Then she moved. She crossed the room in quick, uncertain steps and stopped beside the bed. Harry took her hand in his bandaged fingers, wrapping around her smaller ones, holding on as if she might disappear if he let go. I'm still here. His voice was barely above a whisper, raw from smoke and emotion. I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. Alice looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and let her head fall against his shoulder, and they stayed that way as the afternoon light shifted across the walls and the monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Harry held his daughter and thought about the choice he had made that morning. Running into that building had been reckless. It had been dangerous. It had nearly cost Alice the only parent she had left. But a woman was alive because of that choice. A woman with a son named Miles who had called her at 6 in the morning. A woman who would get to send the message she had never sent, make the apology she had never made, have the second chance she had never expected. Was that worth the risk? Was anything worth the risk of leaving his daughter alone? Harry didn't know. Maybe he would never know. All he knew was that he was alive, and Alice was beside him, and somehow against all odds, they had both survived another day. In another part of the hospital, 3 floors up and a corridor away, a woman named Serena Mitchell was opening her eyes for the first time since she had been carried out of the smoke. The ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar. The sheets beneath her were stiff with institutional starch. Her throat felt like she had swallowed sandpaper, and when she tried to move, pain flared across her shoulders and down her back. But she was alive. The thoughts settled into her consciousness slowly like water seeping into dry earth. She was alive. She had been trapped in a burning building, surrounded by smoke, unable to breathe, unable to move. She had thought she was going to die. And then someone had appeared. A man, Ken. His face was blurred and her memory obscured by smoke and terror, in the particular confusion of consciousness slipping away. But she remembered his voice. Calm, steady, certain in a way that made her believe, if only for a moment, that everything might be okay. Your son is calling you. You're going to answer that call. Her hand moved instinctively toward the bedside table, searching for her phone. Her fingers closed around the familiar shape, and she brought it to her face with hands that trembled. The screen was cracked, a spider web of fractures spreading from one corner, but it still worked. Serena navigated to her messages with the automatic muscle memory of a woman who had spent years with her phone as her constant companion. 14 missed calls from Miles. The number hit her like a physical blow. 14 times her son had called. 14 times he had reached out desperate to know if his mother was alive, and 14 times the call had gone unanswered. She pressed the callback button before she could think, before she could plan what she was going to say, before she could do any of the things that she normally did before making calls. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice high and scared and so achingly familiar that Serena felt tears spring to her eyes. Mom, Mom, are you okay? They said on the news there was a fire. They said people were hurt. I'm okay. The words came out rough, broken by smoke damage and emotion. I'm okay, baby. I'm so sorry I didn't answer. I'm so sorry I never. She couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in her throat, all the apologies she should have made over the years, all the promises she should have kept, all the moments she should have been present instead of chasing the next deadline, the next promotion, the next proof that she was worth something. Mom, it's okay. Miles's voice had changed, shifting from fear to something softer, more fragile. I was just scared. I love you. I love you too. Serena's voice cracked on the words. More than anything, more than everything. I should have told you that more. I should have been there more. I should have, Mom. Her son's voice was gentle, patient in the way that children sometimes are when their parents need comfort. Are you really okay? Serena looked around the hospital room, at the monitors tracking her vital signs, at the bandages on her shoulder where something had scraped her during the escape she barely remembered, at the fourth dripping fluids into her arm. I'm really okay, she said, and I'm going to be better, I promise. The conversation ended a few minutes later with Miles extracting a promise that she would call again that evening, that she would rest, that she would not try to go back to work for at least a week. Serena agreed to everything, meant all of it, and wondered if this was what it felt like to wake up. She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the man who had carried her through the fire. She had been barely conscious, more dead than alive, but she remembered fragments, the strength of his arms around her, the determination in his voice, the way he had looked at her phone when it rang with her son's name, as if that name meant something to him too. Who was he? Why had he risked his life for a stranger? She would find out. She would find him and thank him, and somehow in some way repay a debt that could never really be repaid. But first she needed to call Robert Walsh in HR and tell him she wouldn't be at the interviews that afternoon. First she needed to deal with the practical realities of nearly dying in a fire that had started in the apartment above hers, probably from an electrical fault that someone should have caught during the last inspection. First she needed to figure out how to be the person that man had seen when he looked at her phone and decided she was worth saving. On the bedside table, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. Serena glanced at the screen. From Miles. I love you too, Mom. Get better soon. And for the first time and longer than she could remember, Serena Mitchell smiled. That evening, as the sun set over Cleveland and the hospital corridors grew quiet with the particular hush of institutions preparing for night, Harry Thompson's phone rang. He was alone in his room, Alice having finally agreed to go home and get some sleep after extracting a promise that he would call if anything changed. The nurse had helped him answer, holding the phone to his ear, because his bandaged hands couldn't manage the task. The voice on the other end was professional, measured exactly what you would expect from a human resources director, calling about a job that someone had failed to show up for. Mr. Thompson, this is Robert Walsh from Morrison Construction. We heard about what happened this morning. Harry closed his eyes. Here it came, the polite rejection, the thanks for applying, the door closing on everything he had hoped for. I'm sorry I missed the interview, he said. His voice was still rough, still bearing the marks of smoke and exhaustion. I understand if the position has been filled. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Robert Walsh said something that Harry had not expected. Mr. Thompson, we'd like to reschedule. Would the day after tomorrow work for you? Harry's eyes opened. We can wait longer if you need it, Robert continued. A week, 2 weeks, however long the doctors say. But I want you to know what you did this morning, that's exactly the kind of person we want on our team. The words hung in the air, struggling to find purchase in Harry's exhausted mind. I should also tell you something, Robert said, his voice taking on a different quality. The woman you saved this morning, she works for us, Serena Mitchell. She's the vice president of operations. She'll be one of the people interviewing you. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that Harry couldn't quite process. The woman in the fire, the woman he had carried through flames, she was connected to the one he needed, to the future he was trying to build. I didn't know, Harry said finally. I know, Robert replied. That's part of why we want to talk to you. The call ended a few minutes later with a confirmed interview time, 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. Harry set the phone down and stared at the darkened window, watching the reflection of his bandaged arms in the glass. He had saved a stranger's life, And that stranger, by some twist of fate that felt too large to be coincidence, held his future in her hands. What happened next would depend on choices that hadn't been made yet, on conversations that hadn't been had, on the answer to a question that Harry couldn't stop asking himself: had he done the right thing? He thought about Alice alone in their apartment, probably lying awake in her bed and worrying about him. He thought about Serena Mitchell, whoever she was beyond the woman he had carried through smoke and flame. He thought about the way her phone had rung with her son's name, about the desperate way she had whispered about a message she had never sent. Everyone had someone waiting for them. Everyone had something worth living for. Tomorrow he would have to face the consequences of his choices: the damaged lungs, the burned arm, the promise to his daughter that he had broken again. But tonight, in this hospital room with its beeping monitors and antiseptic smell, Harry allowed himself a single moment of something that felt almost like peace. He was alive. The woman was alive. And somewhere out there, a 12-year-old boy named Miles had gotten to hear his mother's voice one more time. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. The morning came slowly to Cleveland gray light filtering through hospital windows, bringing with it the promise of difficult conversations and uncertain futures. Serena Mitchell woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the bedside table, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the smell hit her. Antiseptic, recycled air, the particular institutional staleness of a hospital room. The memories came flooding back. The smoke, the fire, the man who had appeared out of nowhere and told her that her son was calling. She reached for her phone and saw a message from Robert Walsh. Interview rescheduled for Thursday. Harry Thompson confirmed. Please advise on your availability for the panel. Harry Thompson. That was his name. The man who had saved her life was named Harry Thompson, and he was going to be sitting across from her in a conference room in 2 days interviewing for a job that she would help decide whether he got. Serena stared at the message for a long time. Then she called to Robert. I need to recuse myself from the hiring decision. Her voice was stronger than it had been yesterday, the smoke damage fading, but there was a tremor underneath that she couldn't quite control. Serena, that's not necessary. He saved my life, Robert. How can I objectively evaluate him? It's a conflict of interest. There was a pause. She could hear Robert thinking, weighing the legal implications against the practical realities. Finally, legal says you can participate as long as you don't cast the deciding vote. Your expertise is valuable. We need someone who understands operations on that panel. And if he's not qualified, if the other candidates are better, then we hire someone else. But Serena, I've seen his file. 18 years with Cleveland Fire, 127 rescues, 3 commendations. He's more than qualified. Serena looked out the window at the gray Cleveland morning. Somewhere out there, Harry Thompson was probably lying in a hospital bed, just like hers, dealing with the consequences of a choice that had nearly killed him. He hadn't known who she was, hadn't known she could help his career. He had run into that building because it was the right thing to do, and now she had to decide whether she could do the same. Fine, she said finally. I'll be there Thursday, but I'm not voting on his candidacy. She hung up and turned back to her phone, scrolling through the missed messages from the past 24 hours. Work emails mostly. Project updates that had suddenly lost their urgency. A text from her ex-husband asking if she was okay, having seen the news. And at the bottom of the thread, the last message she had received before the fire. Mom, are you coming this weekend? Her thumb hovered over the reply button. 2 days ago, she would have hesitated, would have calculated, would have checked her calendar and her commitments and all the reasons why she couldn't make promises. Now she typed without thinking, yes, I'm coming, and I'm staying the whole weekend. I love you, Miles. The reply came almost instantly. Really, the whole weekend? Serena smiled at the disbelief in her son's message. She had earned that disbelief. She had taught him through years of broken promises and last-minute cancellations to expect disappointment. Really, she typed back. I'll explain everything when I see you, but some things are going to change. I promise. She hit send and set the phone down. Through the window, the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long rays of golden light across the Cleveland skyline. It looked like hope. It felt like a second chance. 2 days until the interview. 2 days until she would sit across from the man who had carried her through fire and decide whether to help him or step aside. 2 days to figure out what kind of person she wanted to be. The clock on the wall ticked toward a future that neither of them could see, carrying with it all the weight of choices made and promises kept, and the strange, terrible, beautiful randomness of two lives colliding in smoke and flame and somehow against all odds emerging into light. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made Cleveland feel like a city carved from ice. Harry stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with the critical eye of a man about to walk into the most important room of his life. The bandages on his arms were thinner now, the burns healing faster than the doctors had expected. 2 days of rest had done what it could for his lungs, though every deep breath still carried a faint rasp, a reminder of smoke that had left marks invisible to the eye. The suit hung on his frame the way it had 3 years ago, slightly stiff at the shoulders, the fabric carrying memories of rain and grief, and a casket disappearing into the earth. Alice appeared in the doorway behind him, her reflection joining his in the mirror. She was dressed for school, backpack slung over one shoulder, but she made no move to leave. "You don't have to do this today." Her voice carried the particular mix of concern and frustration that teenagers reserve for parents who refuse to act sensibly. They said they could wait. Harry adjusted his tie, a burgundy stripe that Grace had bought him years ago for some occasion he could no longer remember. "I've waited long enough." "Dad," he turned to face her directly. In the harsh bathroom light, he could see the shadows under her eyes, evidence of nights spent worrying instead of sleeping. She had her mother's stubbornness, the same set to her jaw when she had decided something was wrong and refused to let it go. "The job isn't going anywhere. You can barely lift your arms. Your lungs, my lungs are fine." "Your lungs are the reason you're applying for this job in the first place." Alice's voice cracked on the words, and for a moment she looked younger than 14, smaller, more fragile. "You almost died 2 days ago. You were in a fire without any gear, and you almost died, and now you want to walk into an interview like nothing happened." Harry crossed the narrow bathroom and put his hands on his daughter's shoulders. The movement pulled at the tender skin beneath his bandages, sent little sparks of pain through nerve endings that hadn't finished healing. He ignored it. "I want to walk into that interview because something happened. Because I made a choice and now I have to live with the consequences of that choice. Part of living with it means moving forward." Alice stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and straightened his tie at a gesture so much like her mother that Harry felt his chest tighten. "You're impossible. I learned it from you." A ghost of a smile crossed her face there and gone. "Call me after, the minute it's done." "I promise." The word hung between them, heavier now than it had been before. Promises meant something different in the Thompson household since Tuesday morning. They were no longer automatic assurances, but carefully measured commitments, each one carrying the weight of everything that could go wrong. Alice nodded once, then turned and walked toward the front door. Harry heard it open and close, and then he was alone with his reflection and the suit that had seen him through the worst day of his life and might now carry him into a new one. Across the city, Serena Mitchell sat in her office on the 15th floor, staring at a personnel file that she had read 6 times already without absorbing a single word. Harry Thompson, 43 years old, 18 years with Cleveland Fire Department, 127 documented rescues, 3 commendations from the mayor's office, exemplary service record, recommended for promotion twice but declined both times, citing a preference for fieldwork over administrative duties. The photograph attached to the file showed a man in his department uniform, his expression serious, professional, revealing nothing of the person beneath. Serena had stared at that photograph for 15 minutes, trying to reconcile it with the blurred memory of the man who had appeared through the smoke, whose voice had cut through her terror with words about her son and a phone call and a future she had nearly lost. "Your son is calling you. You're going to answer that call." She had answered. She had called miles back and heard his voice and felt something break loose inside her that had been frozen for years. And now in 2 hours she would sit across a conference table from the man who had given her that moment, and she would have to pretend that she was capable of objectivity. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Robert Walsh stood in the doorway, his expression carrying the particular blend of professional concern and personal curiosity that he had worn since learning about Serena's connection to the morning's candidate. "Interview prep meeting in the 20 minutes. You still want to be there?" Serena closed the personnel file. "I told you I would be. And I'm giving you one more chance to change your mind." Nobody would blame you, Serena. The man saved your life. It's understandable if you'd rather what hide in my office while other people decide his future. Serena stood smoothing the front of her blazer with hands that were steadier than they had been 2 days ago. I'm not recusing myself from the panel. I'm only recusing myself from the final vote. Robert studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his eyes. You know there's going to be talk. People will wonder if we're giving him special treatment because of what happened. Are we? I don't know, and Robert's voice was honest, which was one of the things Serena had always appreciated about him. His qualifications are excellent. His experience is exactly what we need. But I also can't pretend that I haven't been thinking about that fire every time I look at his file. Serena picked up a stack of papers from her desk, interview questions and evaluation rubrics and all the machinery of professional decision-making. Then we do this by the book. We ask the same questions we would ask any candidate. We evaluate him on the same criteria. And if he's the best person for the job, we hire him. Not because he saved my life, because he earned it. And if he's not the best person? The question landed harder than Robert had probably intended. Serena thought about the smoke and the fear and the moment when she had been certain she was going to die without ever telling her son she was sorry. Then we hire someone else. The words came out steady, professional, exactly what a vice president of operations should say. But underneath them, in a place that Serena had spent years learning to hide, something else stirred. Something that felt uncomfortably like doubt. The conference room was exactly as Harry remembered from the flash of memory that had been his first glimpse of it 2 days ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a mahogany table long enough to seat 12. 3 chairs arranged on one side, a single chair on the other. He was early, 20 minutes early, because the alternative was sitting in the hospital waiting room, watching the clock and feeling his heart rate climb with each passing minute. The receptionist had shown him to the room with a professional smile and offered him coffee, which he had declined because his hands were trembling enough without adding caffeine to the equation. Now he sat alone, staring out at the Cleveland skyline, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. The burns on his arms throbbed beneath his sleeves. His lungs ached with each breath, a low-grade discomfort that he had learned to ignore but couldn't quite forget. The doctors had warned him about overexertion, about the importance of rest, about the long-term consequences of pushing a damaged body too hard. He had thanked them for their concern and walked out of the hospital 12 hours ahead of their recommended schedule. Alice was right. He was impossible, but impossible was the only thing he knew how to be. The door opened behind him and Harry rose from his chair, turning to face whatever came next. 3 people entered. Robert Walsh, the HR director, looking exactly as his voice had sounded on the phone, professional, measured the kind of man who had learned to read people by asking the right questions. Sandra Miller, head of legal compliance, her expression neutral in the way of lawyers who had been trained to reveal nothing. And behind them, moving with a composure that seemed almost fragile at the edges, Serena Mitchell. She looked different than she had in the fire. That woman had been desperate, terrified, choking on smoke, and clinging to consciousness by a thread. This woman was polished, professional, her dark hair pulled back from a face that bore the fading traces of a bruise along one cheekbone. She wore a blazer that probably cost more than Harry's monthly rent, and she carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had spent years learning to command attention. But when their eyes met across the conference table, Harry saw something familiar. A flash of recognition, a weight of gratitude and uncertainty, and something else that neither of them could name. Robert's voice broke the moment. Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat. I'm Robert Walsh, Director of Human Resources. This is Sandra Miller, our Head of Compliance, and Serena Mitchell, Vice President of Operations. Harry shook hands with each of them in turn. Robert's grip was firm, professional. Sandra's was brief, evaluating. And Serena's was the handshake of a woman holding a complicated equation in her head, trying to balance gratitude against objectivity, personal debt against professional responsibility. The interview began. Robert led with the standard questions, the kind that Harry had prepared for in the quiet hours of his hospital room. Experience, qualifications, philosophy on workplace safety. Harry answered as best he could, drawing on 18 years of fieldwork, explaining how he had seen the consequences of cutting corners, how he believed that safety was not about paperwork, but about people. OSHA reports that 1,069 construction workers died on the job in 2024. Harry's voice was steady, measured the voice of a man who had spent years delivering difficult truths. That's 20% of all workplace fatalities. Most of them were preventable. Someone decided a procedure took too long. Someone thought a safety check was unnecessary. Someone looked at the numbers and decided that speed mattered more than lives. Sandra leaned forward, her pen moving across her notepad. And how would you address that culture if you were in this position? By making it personal. Harry looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Numbers are easy to ignore. It's easy to look at a statistic and think it won't happen to you, to your workers, to your company. But when you've carried someone out of a collapsed building, when you've told a family that their father isn't coming home, when you've seen what happens when safety fails, it stops being a number. It becomes a face, a name, a life. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Robert nodded and moved on to the next question. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Questions about regulatory compliance, about training protocols, about how Harry would handle conflicts between project timelines and safety requirements. He answered all of them, honestly drawing on experiences that the other candidates probably couldn't match, trying to translate 18 years of running into fires into the language of corporate policy and risk management. Through it all, Serena remained mostly silent. She took notes. She observed. Occasionally, she asked a clarifying question, her voice neutral, her expression giving nothing away. But Harry could feel her attention like a physical presence, could sense the weight of everything that lay between them, pressing against the professional distance of the interview. Finally, Sandra looked up from her notepad. Mr. Thompson, I see in your file that you were involved in an off-duty rescue operation earlier this week. Can you tell us more about that? The question hung in the air like smoke. Harry glanced at Serena. Her pen had stopped moving. I was driving home after my shift. Harry's voice was careful, measured, each word chosen with precision. I saw smoke coming from an apartment building. The fire department hadn't arrived yet. There was a woman trapped on the 4th floor. You went in without equipment. Sandra's tone was neutral, but there was something sharp beneath it. Without backup. Without any of the protective gear that would normally be required for such an operation. Some would call that reckless. They would be right. The admission seemed to surprise Sandra. She sat back slightly, her pen hovering over her notepad. I have a daughter. Harry's voice softened on the words. 14 years old. I promised her I would come home every night. Going into that building could have broken that promise forever. He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. But I've spent 18 years running into fires. And I've learned that the moment you stop seeing people as people, the moment they become statistics or acceptable losses or somebody else's problem, that's when you lose something you can't get back. His eyes met Serena's across the table, and for a moment the professional distance between them collapsed. I couldn't walk away, not and live with myself afterward. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was heavier, more charged, filled with things that couldn't be said in a job interview. Then Serena spoke. Mr. Thompson? Her voice was steady, professional, but there was something underneath it that the others in the room couldn't hear. Do you regret your decision? Harry considered the question, considered the burns on his arms and the damage to his lungs and the fear in Alice's eyes when she had walked into his hospital room. Considered the woman sitting across from him alive because he had made a choice that most people would have been too smart to make. I regret scaring my daughter. I regret the pain I caused her, the worry she felt, the promises I broke. His voice was quiet but certain. But the decision itself, no. I don't regret it. Serena held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them that the evaluation rubrics and interview protocols couldn't capture. Then she nodded once and looked down at her notes. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That will be all for now. Robert stood and extended his hand. We'll be in touch within the week. Thank you for your time. Harry shook hands with each of them again and walked toward the door. He was almost through it when Serena's voice stopped him. Mr. Thompson, could you stay for a moment? Robert and Sandra exchanged a glance. Serena waved them off with a gesture that carried the casual authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. I just have a few follow-up questions. I'll catch up with you both later. The others gathered their materials and left. The door closed behind them, and suddenly Harry was alone with the woman whose life he had saved. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. The conference room felt smaller now, more intimate, the vast windows framing a city that knew nothing of the complicated geometry of gratitude and obligation that connected the two people standing within it. Serena stood and walked around the table, stopping a few feet from where Harry stood. Up close, he could see the fading bruise along her cheekbone, the trace of smoke damage at the corners of her eyes, the particular exhaustion that comes from surviving something you didn't expect to survive. Her voice when she spoke was different than it had been during the interview, softer, more honest. I never got to thank you. You don't have to. Yes. The word carried a weight that surprised them both. I do. She took a breath, and for a moment the professional composure she had maintained throughout the interview seemed to waver. You almost died for me, a complete stranger. You ran into a burning building without equipment, without backup, knowing you might not come out. You had a daughter waiting for you at home, a life of future, and you risked all of it for someone you had never met. Harry didn't know what to say. The words she was speaking were true, but hearing them from her mouth made them feel different, larger, more complicated than they had seemed in the moment. I did what anyone would do. Serena shook her head. No, anyone would have driven away. Anyone would have told themselves it wasn't their responsibility, that the professionals were on their way, that the risk was too great. You made a choice that most people wouldn't make. She turned toward the window, looking out at the city spread below them. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more vulnerable. In the fire, when I was barely conscious, I kept thinking about my son. I had a text message I never sent. I was always putting work first, telling myself I would make it up to him later, that there would be time, that he would understand. She paused, her reflection ghostly against the glass. And then I thought I was going to die, and all I could think was that I never told him I was sorry. For the missed birthdays, the broken promises, all the times I chose work over him because I was too afraid to slow down, too afraid to be the kind of mother who didn't have all the answers. Harry stood very still, aware that he was witnessing something private, something that Serena Mitchell probably didn't share with many people. Do you know what I did first when I woke up in the hospital? He shook his head. I called him. Her voice cracked slightly. For the first time in years, I called him without checking my calendar first, without having a reason. I just called to say I love him. She turned back to face Harry, and he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears, though she held herself with the particular dignity of someone who had learned not to cry in professional settings. You gave me that. You gave me the chance to make things right with my son. I don't know how to repay that. I don't know if it can be repaid. Harry thought about Alice, about the fear in her eyes when she had walked into his hospital room, about the way she had held his hand and told him he was impossible, and looked at him with a love that was fierce enough to hurt. I have a daughter too. His voice was quiet. I know what it's like to worry that you're not enough, that you're making mistakes you can't take back, that one day they'll look at you and see all the ways you failed instead of all the ways you tried. Serena studied him for a long moment. She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. The silence between them shifted, becoming something warmer, more human. Two people who had been connected by fire and chance, finding common ground in the complicated territory of parenthood. I want you to know something. Serena's voice was steady again, back on solid ground. I've recused myself from the hiring decision. I won't cast a vote on your candidacy. Whatever happens, it will be based entirely on your qualifications and your interview performance. I appreciate that. But for what it's worth, I think you're exactly what this company needs. Someone who understands that safety isn't about checking boxes or meeting compliance standards. It's about protecting people, making sure they go home to their families at the end of the day. She extended her hand. Harry took it. The handshake was different this time, less formal, carrying something that felt like the beginning of mutual respect. Whatever happens, Mr. Thompson, thank you for everything. Harry nodded once. Then he turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the woman he had saved and the future that was no longer entirely in his hands. The elevator descended 15 floors to the lobby, and with each passing number, Harry felt something shift inside him. The interview was over. The words had been spoken. Now all that remained was waiting. His phone buzzed as he stepped out into the cold Cleveland afternoon. A text from Alice. Well, he typed back, it went okay, I think, coming home now. The reply came immediately. That's not an answer, Dad. Harry smiled, the first real smile he had managed in days. I know. I'll tell you everything when I get there. He pocketed his phone and started walking toward the parking garage, his breath fogging in the winter air. The city moved around him with its usual indifference, cars and pedestrians, and the endless machinery of urban life continuing on as if this particular Thursday afternoon was no different from any other. But for Harry Thompson, everything was different now. He had walked into a burning building and come out changed. He had sat across from the woman he had saved and spoken words that he hadn't known he was capable of speaking. He had done something impossible, and now he had to wait and see if the impossible would be enough. Back on the 15th floor, Serena Mitchell stood alone in the conference room, staring out at the city that had been her entire world for so long. The interview was over. The professional obligations had been met. And still she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful architecture of her life had been rearranged by a man who had carried her through fire and asked for nothing in return. Her phone buzzed. A text from Miles. Mom, are we still doing this weekend? She typed her response without hesitation. Yes, the whole weekend, I promise. The word felt different in her mouth now. Heavier, more real. Promises had always been easy for Serena to make and difficult to keep. But standing here in the same room where she had just questioned a man about the choices he had made, she understood something she hadn't understood before. Promises weren't just words, they were decisions. Every time you made one, you were choosing what kind of person you wanted to be. She had spent years choosing work over family achievement, over connection, the next promotion, over the people who loved her. And where had it gotten her? A corner office and a son who had learned to expect disappointment. But it wasn't too late. That was what Tuesday morning had taught her. It wasn't too late to make different choices, to keep different promises, to become the mother her son deserved. She gathered her papers and headed for the door, leaving behind the conference room and the complicated emotions it had contained. There was work to do, decisions to make, a life to rebuild, one choice at a time. And somewhere in Cleveland, a man she barely knew was driving home to a daughter who had almost lost him, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important things in life aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones you fight for. The days that followed moved with the particular slowness of time measured in waiting. Harry returned to his apartment and tried to rest as the doctors had ordered, but rest had never come easily to him, and now it seemed almost impossible. Alice went to school and came home and did her homework at the kitchen table, while Harry sat across from her, pretending to read a book, while actually watching the phone that refused to ring. They ate dinner together, watched television together, existed in the comfortable silence of two people who had learned to speak without words. On Friday afternoon, Harry's former captain called. The news was not good. Harry, I'm calling about your status. Captain Williams's voice carried the weight of difficult conversations. The department has reviewed your medical records from Tuesday. The additional lung damage combined with your existing condition, it's too much. We can't clear you for active duty. Harry had known this was coming, had known it since the moment he had run into that building. But knowing something and hearing it spoken aloud were different things. What are my options? Medical retirement, full pension. You've earned it, Harry. 18 years of service, everything you've given to this department. Nobody would question it. The words settled into Harry's chest like stones. Medical retirement. The end of a career he had built one fire at a time, one rescue at a time, one moment of running toward danger while everyone else ran away. And if I don't want to retire, a pause, then we have a problem, because I can't put you back on the truck, Harry. Not after what happened. Your lungs won't handle it. The next fire, the next serious smoke exposure, it could kill you. Harry thought about Alice, about the promise he had made her, about the job interview that might or might not lead to a future different from the one he was losing. I understand. I'm sorry. Captain Williams's voice softened. You're one of the best firefighters I've ever worked with. If there was any other way, there isn't, I know. The call ended, and Harry sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the phone that had just delivered the formal conclusion to 20 years of his life. The suit was hanging in his closet. The bills were still spread across the table. And somewhere in a corporate office building, people were deciding whether to give him a chance at a different kind of future. The weekend passed. Sunday morning brought cold rain and a text from Robert Walsh. Decision meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll call you by noon. Harry read the message 3 times. Then he put the phone down and went to find Alice. She was in her room working on something at her desk. When Harry knocked on the door frame, she looked up with the particular expression of a teenager interrupted mid-thought. They're deciding tomorrow. Alice set down her pencil. And I'm scared. The admission surprised them both. Harry Thompson did not admit to fear. He ran into burning buildings and carried strangers through smoke and faced down the worst that life could throw at him. Fear was not supposed to be part of his vocabulary, but standing in his daughter's doorway looking at the girl who was the center of everything that mattered, Harry understood that fear had always been there. He had just learned to translate it into action, to convert terror into purpose, to run toward the thing that frightened him, because standing still was even worse. Alice stood up and crossed the room. She was almost as tall as him, now growing up so fast that sometimes Harry couldn't quite believe she was the same baby he had held in the hospital 14 years ago. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed too large for her 14 years. We'll figure it out. We always do. Harry pulled her into a hug, ignoring the protest of his still healing arms. When did you get so wise? I learned it from Mom. The words landed gently, a touch of grace in the present moment. Harry held his daughter and let himself feel the fear, let himself acknowledge that the future was uncertain and the outcome was out of his hands. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you're afraid. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. In a conference room on the 15th floor of Morrison Construction's headquarters, 3 people sat around a table covered with evaluation forms and candidate files. Robert Walsh spread the paperwork before him like a general reviewing battle plans. We have 4 finalists. Let's go through them one at a time. The first 2 candidates were exactly what their resumes suggested: competent, qualified, forgettable. They had the right credentials and the right experience, and absolutely nothing that distinguished them from 100 other people who could fill the same role. The third candidate was a woman named Patricia Chen, an engineer with 10 years of safety consulting experience and a master's degree from Case Western. Her interview had been impressive. Her answers polished, her understanding of regulatory frameworks comprehensive. She's strong. Sandra made a note on her evaluation form. Probably our safest choice. Robert nodded. Agreed. She knows the industry, knows the regulations, has the academic background we were looking for. Serena remained silent, her pen resting on the table. Which brings us to Harry Thompson. Robert opened the 4th folder. 18 years with Cleveland Fire, no degree, limited corporate experience. But his field record is extraordinary, and his interview answers showed a depth of understanding that the other candidates couldn't match. Sandra frowned. His medical situation concerns me. The injuries from Tuesday on top of his existing lung damage. Are we confident he can handle the physical demands of this role? The role is primarily administrative. Robert flipped through the medical documentation. Site visits, inspections, training, supervision. Nothing that should put undue strain on his condition. And the incident itself, running into a burning building without equipment, without authorization, some would see that as evidence of poor judgment. Robert hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. It was Serena who spoke. Or evidence that he understands what's at stake in a way that the other candidates don't. Both Robert and Sandra turned to look at her. Serena had been largely silent throughout the discussion, participating, but not leading, offering opinions, but not advocating. Now something in her expression had changed. We're not hiring someone to check boxes and file reports. Her voice carried the particular authority of someone who had spent years learning to command attention. We're hiring someone to make sure our workers go home to their families at night. Someone who understands that safety isn't an abstract concept. It's a decision you make in the moment when everything is going wrong and you have to choose between what's safe and what's right. She looked at the folder in Robert's hands. Harry Thompson made that choice. He made it knowing what it could cost him, knowing he might not survive, knowing that his daughter would be left alone if things went wrong. And he made it anyway, because he understood that some things are more important than your own survival. Sandra's pen had stopped moving. You're not supposed to be advocating for him. I'm not advocating, I'm not voting, but I am telling you what I observed both in that interview and in that building. Serena's voice was steady, certain. This man understands something that you can't learn in a classroom or a consulting firm. He understands that every safety protocol, every inspection, and every piece of paperwork represents a human life. And he will never forget that, ever. The room was silent. Robert looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at Robert. Some communication passed between them that didn't require words. All right, Robert closed the folder. Let's put it to a vote. At 11:47 on Monday morning, Harry Thompson's phone rang. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the same page of a book he had been pretending to read for the past 3 hours. Alice was at school. The apartment was quiet. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. The phone buzzed against the table and Harry's heart stopped. He answered without looking at the screen. Hello, Tom. Mr. Thompson, this is Robert Walsh from Morrison Construction. Harry's hand tightened around the phone. Yes, I'm calling to offer you the position of safety director. Robert's voice carried something that might have been a smile. If you're still interested. The world went very still. Harry heard himself discuss start dates and salary details and benefits packages, heard himself say thank you in a voice that didn't quite feel like his own. The conversation ended, and he sat alone in his kitchen, holding a phone that had just delivered the beginning of a different future. Then he called Alice. She answered on the second ring. Dad, what happened? I got the job. Silence, then a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and the particular noise of relief and joy colliding. I told you, as Alice's voice was fierce with vindication. I told you you would get it. You did. Dad, I'm coming home. I'm leaving school right now. Alice, you can't just, I'm coming home. The phone went dead. Harry set down the phone and looked around the apartment. The bills were still on the table. The suit was still in the closet. Everything was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, but everything was different now. An hour later, a courier arrived with an envelope bearing the Morrison Construction logo. Harry signed for it with bandaged hands and carried it inside, not opening it until he was seated at the kitchen table. The letter inside was on heavy paper, the kind that costs more per sheet than some people spend on dinner. He read it twice before the words sank in. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that the decision to hire you was made entirely on the basis of your qualifications and interview performance. I recused myself from the final vote as I had promised. The hiring committee selected you because they believe you are the best candidate for this position, not because of any personal connection between us. But I also want you to know something else. Last weekend, I took my son to a soccer game. It was the first time in 2 years that I had been to one of his games. He asked me why I was there, and I told him that someone had taught me a lesson about keeping promises. I didn't mention your name. I didn't tell him about the fire or the hospital or any of it. But I want you to know that what you did that morning changed more than just my survival. It changed how I understand what matters. You didn't just save my life. You gave me a reason to live it differently. I look forward to working with you. Serena Mitchell, Vice President of Operations Morrison Construction. Harry read the letter a third time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. The door burst open and Alice came through like a force of nature backpack abandoned on the floor, arms wrapping around her father before he could fully stand. You did it. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. You actually did it. Harry held his daughter and felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The fire, the hospital, the interview. The choice he had made on a cold Tuesday morning that had nearly cost him everything and somehow given him everything instead. Sometimes the most important decisions in life don't announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, as smoke on a winter morning, as a stranger at a window. And the only way to recognize them is to be the kind of person who pays attention, who notices when something matters, who understands that every life has value, even the lives of people you've never met. Harry Thompson had spent 18 years running toward danger. Now he would spend the next phase of his life teaching others how to prevent it. Different work, different purpose, but the same fundamental truth at the center of it all. People mattered. Promises mattered. The choices you made when no one was watching those were the choices that defined who you were. Alice pulled back and looked up at Pinehill Father with eyes that held all the hope and fear and love of a child who had almost lost the only parent she had left. What happens now? Harry smiled, the first real smile he had managed in days. Now we find out what comes next. 6 months passed like water through fingers each day, carrying Harry further from the fire and closer to something he hadn't expected to find peace. The office they gave him occupied a corner of the 8th floor, smaller than Serena's, but with windows that looked out over the city he had spent 2 decades protecting. He filled it with training manuals and safety regulations and photographs of construction sites he had inspected, but the item that mattered most sat on his desk in a simple frame, a picture of Alice at her 8th grade graduation grinning at the camera with the particular joy of someone who had survived something difficult and come out stronger. The work was different from anything Harry had done before. Instead of running toward fires, he spent his days preventing them. Instead of carrying people out of burning buildings, he wrote protocols and conducted inspections and trained workers to recognize dangers before they became disasters. It was quieter work, slower measured in spreadsheets and compliance reports rather than sirens and smoke. But it mattered. Every protocol he implemented, every inspection he completed, every worker he trained represented a family that wouldn't receive a phone call in the middle of the night, a child who wouldn't lose a parent, a spouse who wouldn't have to learn how to sleep alone. Harry had spent 18 years saving lives one at a time. Now he was learning to save them by the hundreds. The scars on his arms had faded from angry red to pale pink, visible reminders of a morning that had changed everything. His lungs still ached on cold days, still caught when he climbed too many stairs or walked too fast. But he had learned to work within his limitations, to pace himself, to accept that the body he had now was different from the body he had before. Acceptance. It had taken him 43 years to learn that word, and he was still practicing. On the morning of July 17th, Harry arrived at the office to find an email from Serena Mitchell waiting in his inbox. Quarterly Safety Review Meeting, 10 a.m. Conference Room B. Your report on the Riverside project is on the agenda. Professional, businesslike, exactly what you would expect from a vice president communicating with a department head. But Harry had learned to read the spaces between Serena's words. In the 6 months since he had started at Morrison, they had developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and shared understanding. They didn't talk about the fire, didn't reference the morning that had connected them in ways that corporate hierarchies couldn't quite contain. But it was there always a foundation beneath everything else. He saw her occasionally in the hallways and meetings at the company events that required attendance from senior staff. She had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. She left the office earlier, now taking calls from Miles instead of sending them to voicemail. She had photographs on her desk that hadn't been there before: her son at a soccer game, the two of them at what looked like a beach somewhere warm. The woman who had fallen asleep with an unsent text message was learning slowly to keep her promises. The meeting that morning was routine, the kind of quarterly review that every corporation conducted to satisfy regulatory requirements and board expectations. Harry presented his findings on the Riverside project: safety violations identified and corrected, training sessions completed, accident rates reduced by 37% since the new protocols had been implemented. The numbers told a story of progress, of lives protected, of a department that was doing its job. But Harry knew that numbers were only part of the picture. Behind every statistic was a worker who went home safe, a family that stayed intact, a tragedy that never happened. After the meeting, Serena caught his eye and nodded toward the hallway. He followed her out of the conference room, away from the other attendees, to a quiet corner near the windows. Your report was excellent. Her voice carried the professional approval of a supervisor pleased with the subordinate's work. The board was impressed. Thank you. A pause. The Cleveland skyline stretched out behind her, the city going about its business, unaware of the conversation happening 15 floors above. Miles has a tournament this weekend. Regional finals. Serena's voice shifted, becoming something more personal. He wanted me to tell you that he's been practicing the defensive techniques you showed him. Harry smiled. He had met Miles once at a company picnic 3 months ago. A quiet 12-year-old with his mother's intensity and a passion for soccer that bordered on obsession. They had talked for 20 minutes about positioning and footwork, and Miles had hung on every word like Harry was revealing the secrets of the universe. Tell him to keep his weight forward on penalty kicks. Goalies telegraph their movement if you watch their shoulders. Serena's expression softened. I will. The moment stretched between them, comfortable in a way that had taken months to develop. Two people who had been connected by fire and nearly destroyed by it, finding their way to something that felt like friendship. There's something else. Serena's voice became serious. The board is creating a new position, Director of Corporate Safety overseeing all regional offices. They want someone who can implement what you've done here across the entire company. Harry felt something shift in his chest. Are you offering me a promotion? I'm telling you that your name is at the top of a very short list. Serena met his eyes directly. But I wanted you to hear it from me first, not from HR. And I wanted you to know that this time I won't be recusing myself from the discussion. Why not? Because 6 months ago I removed myself from the process because I couldn't be objective about the man who saved my life. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Now I'm advocating for you because I've watched you work. I've seen what you've built. And I believe you're the best person for this job, not because of what happened in that building, but because of everything you've done since. Harry stood very still, processing the weight of what she was saying. The decision isn't final yet. There will be interviews, evaluations, all the usual corporate machinery. But I wanted you to know where things stand. I appreciate that. Serena nodded once the gesture, carrying something that felt like closure. Then she turned and walked back toward the conference room, leaving Harry alone with the view and the possibility of a future even larger than the one he had imagined. That evening, Harry sat with Alice at the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat on so many difficult nights, and told her about the potential promotion. She listened without interrupting her dinner growing cold on the plate in front of her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Does this mean you'd have to travel? Probably. Visiting regional offices, conducting audits. A few days here and there. Alice nodded slowly, processing. She was 15 now, taller than her mother had been, carrying herself with a confidence that still surprised Harry sometimes. The girl who had cried in his hospital room, who had accused him of breaking promises, had grown into someone who understood that promises came in different forms. You should take it. I haven't been offered it yet. But when they do, Alice met his eyes with a directness that reminded him of Grace. You should take it. You're good at this, Dad. You're making a difference now. Harry reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. What about you? I promised I would be here. I promised I would come home every night. Alice smiled, a small curve of her lips that carried wisdom beyond her years. You promised you would do everything you could to come home. That's different from promising you would never leave. The words landed in Harry's chest with a gentle impact. I'm not 8 anymore, Dad. I'm not going to fall apart if you're gone for a few days. I understand that your work matters. I understand that the things you do help people. She squeezed his hand. Mom would have wanted you to do this. She would have been proud of you. Harry felt his eyes sting with something that might have been tears. He blinked it back. When did you get so grown up? I had a good teacher. They sat together in the kitchen as the evening light faded, father and daughter, the only family each other had left. The apartment was quiet, the bills were paid, and somewhere in the machinery of corporate decision-making, Harry's name was being considered for something larger than he had ever imagined. The future was uncertain. It always was. But sitting here with Alice, Harry understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. The promises that matter most aren't the ones about where you'll be or what you'll do. They're the ones about who you'll be when you get there. 3 weeks later, on an August evening that carried the first hints of autumn, Harry Thompson received the official offer for Director of Corporate Safety. He accepted it the same day. The celebration was small dinner at a restaurant nicer than any they usually visited. Alice dressed up in something she had borrowed from a friend, Harry, wearing a tie that Grace had given him years ago. They ate too much and laughed too loud and talked about everything except the fire that had started it all. Because that was behind them now. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but integrated into the larger story of their lives. A chapter that had ended so that other chapters could begin. The regional speech competition took place on a Saturday morning in late September. Harry sat in the third row of the school auditorium, his new position having given him the flexibility to be here, to be present for the moments that mattered. Alice was one of 12 finalist students from across northeastern Ohio competing for a spot at the state championship. She had been working on her speech for weeks, practicing in her room with the door closed, refusing to let Harry hear even a sentence until the day of the competition. The auditorium filled slowly, parents and teachers and administrators finding their seats. Harry recognized some faces from Alice's school, nodded greetings, made small talk about weather and traffic, and all the ordinary things that people discuss while waiting for something important to begin. Then the lights dimmed and the competition started. The other speakers were good. Articulate, polished, delivering speeches about climate change and social media and the challenges facing their generation. Harry listened with the attention of a father who wanted to be supportive while secretly counting down to the moment when Alice would take the stage. She was the ninth speaker. When her name was called, Harry's heart did something complicated in his chest, a mix of pride and fear and overwhelming love. Alice walked to the podium with steps that were steadier than he had expected. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at the audience, and found her father's face in the crowd. Then she began. "My speech is about heroes." Her voice carried through the auditorium clear and strong. "But not the kind you are probably thinking of. Not superheroes or celebrities or people who make headlines. I want to talk about the ordinary kind, the kind you might not notice unless you're paying attention." Harry felt something shift in his chest. "My dad spent 18 years as a firefighter. He ran into burning buildings while everyone else was running out. He saved 127 people over the course of his career. He has commendations from the mayor and scars on his body and lungs that will never fully heal." Alice paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer. "But he's not a hero because of the rescues or the commendations. He's a hero because of the choices he makes every day. The choice to be present, the choice to keep his promises, the choice to put other people first even when it costs him something." Harry's vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to clear it. "6 months ago, my dad almost died. He ran into a fire without any equipment, without any backup, because there was a woman trapped and the fire department hadn't arrived yet. He saved her life. He also broke his promise to me, the promise to come home safe every night, the promise that I made him make because I had already lost my mom and I couldn't stand to lose anyone else." The auditorium was very quiet. I was angry. I was so angry. I yelled at him in his hospital bed and told him he was selfish and stupid and that he had almost left me alone in the world. Alice's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "But here's what I've learned since then. Here's what I've come to understand. A hero isn't someone who never feels afraid. A hero is someone who feels afraid and does the right thing anyway." She looked directly at her father. "My dad was afraid that morning, afraid of dying, afraid of leaving me, afraid of breaking the promise he had made. But he went into that building anyway because there was someone who needed help and he couldn't walk away. He couldn't be the kind of person who drives past a burning building and tells himself it's not his problem." Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "That's what a hero is, not someone without fear. Someone who acts despite the fear. Someone who understands that the choices we make in the hardest moments are the choices that define us." Alice straightened, her voice growing stronger. "My dad changed his life after that fire. He took a job that keeps him safe, that lets him come home to me every night. But he didn't stop being a hero. He just found a different way to save people. Now he writes the rules that keep workers safe. He trains people to recognize danger before it becomes disaster. He prevents the fires instead of fighting them." She paused, letting the silence build. "In his first 6 months as safety director, my dad implemented 14 new protocols across 12 construction sites. His team conducted 847 safety inspections. Because of his work, 3 accidents were prevented that could have killed people. 3 families that will never get a phone call in the middle of the night. 3 children who won't lose their parents." Alice's voice dropped to something almost intimate. "That's what heroism looks like in the real world. Not capes and superpowers. Patience. Persistence. Showing up every day and doing the work that matters even when nobody's watching. Even when nobody says thank you. Even when the only reward is knowing that somewhere out there someone is going home safe to their family." She looked at the audience, at the judges, at the parents and teachers who had gathered to watch their children compete. We live in a world that celebrates the big moments, the dramatic rescues, the headlines, and the viral videos. But the heroes I believe in are the ones who make 1,000 small choices day after day to protect people they'll never meet. The ones who understand that every life matters, every promise counts, every decision shapes who we become. Her final words came quietly, but they carried across the silent auditorium. My dad taught me that, not with speeches or lectures, with his life, with the way he shows up every day for his work and for me. He taught me that the most important things in life aren't the ones you plan for, they're the ones you fight for. Alice stepped back from the podium. The applause started slowly, then built into something overwhelming, a wave of sound that seemed to lift her off her feet. Harry was crying openly now, not trying to hide it, not caring who saw. His daughter had stood in front of hundreds of people and told them about the worst and best moments of his life, and somehow she had made it beautiful. The competition continued, 3 more speakers delivering their prepared remarks. But Harry barely heard them. He was lost in the echo of Alice's words and the realization that his daughter understood him in ways he hadn't known were possible. When the results were announced, Alice placed second. The winner was a boy who had given a technically perfect speech about renewable energy, hitting every mark on the judge's rubric. Alice received a silver certificate and a handshake from the principal. She didn't seem disappointed. When she found Harry in the crowd afterward, her face was flushed with something that looked like joy. You heard it? I heard it. Alice searched his face. Was it okay? I wasn't sure if I should talk about the fire, about Mom, about any of it. But it's our story, and I wanted— Harry pulled her into a hug, cutting off the stream of words. He held her tight, his daughter who was no longer a child, who had grown into someone capable of standing in front of the strangers and telling the truth about the people she loved. It was perfect. His voice was rough with emotion. You were perfect. They stood there in the crowd of parents and students holding on to each other, and Harry thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The fire, the fear, the hospital room where Alice had yelled at him and cried and told him she couldn't lose anyone else. All of it had led here, to this auditorium, to this embrace, to a future that was still being written one day at a time. Driving home, the late September sun slanting through the windshield, Alice turned to Harry with a question. Dad, do you think things happen for a reason, like fate or destiny or whatever? Harry considered the question. He thought about the morning of the fire, about the route he had chosen without knowing why, about the woman at the window and the phone that had rung with her son's name. I don't know if things happen for a reason. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. But I think we can choose to make meaning out of what happens to us. Alice nodded, processing. So the fire wasn't destiny. Maybe not. But what I did with it, what we both did with it, that's what matters. The fire was just a thing that happened. The choices we made afterward, those were ours. Alice was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took her father's hand on the steering wheel. I'm glad you made the choices you made. Harry squeezed her hand. Me too. They drove in comfortable silence, father and daughter, the city sliding past outside the windows. The apartment building came into view, the same building they had lived in for 15 years, the place where Harry had sat at a kitchen table staring at overdue bills and wondering how he was going to survive. Everything was different now. The bills were paid. The future was secure. And somewhere in a corner office on the 15th floor, a woman named Serena Mitchell was probably finishing up her work, getting ready to go home to a son who no longer had to wonder if his mother would show up. Harry parked the car and sat for a moment looking at the building where so much of his life had happened. Dad, Alice's voice pulled him back. You coming? He smiled. Yeah, I'm coming. They walked to the entrance together, father and daughter, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. The door opened onto the familiar lobby, the same water-stained ceiling and clanking radiators, the same stair they had climbed 1,000 times. But climbing them now, Harry felt different, lighter, like something that had been pressing on his chest for years had finally been lifted. At the top of the stairs, Alice stopped and turned to face him. Dad, I want you to know something. What's that? I'm proud of you. Her voice was simple, direct, carrying no trace of teenage awkwardness or embarrassment. Not just for the bar or the job or any of that. I'm proud of who you are, every day, even when you're annoying. Harry laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been waiting for permission to release. I'm proud of you too, Alice. more than you know. They stood there on the landing, father and daughter, the only family each other had left. The evening light came through the window at the end of the hall, painting everything gold. Harry thought about Grace, about the woman who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, who had given him a daughter and then left too soon. He wondered what she would think if she could see them now, if she would be proud of the people they had become. He thought she would be. "Come on." Alice tugged at his arm. "I'm starving, and you promised to make that pasta thing." "I promised." "You promised." Harry smiled and let his daughter pull him toward their apartment, toward the evening that waited, toward all the ordinary moments that made up a life. The door opened onto the small space they called home, the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had happened, the window that looked out over the city Harry had protected for 20 years. The photographs on this wall, Grace's face smiling out from frames that Alice dusted every Sunday. This was his life now, not running into fires but building something that would last. Not saving one person at a time, but creating systems that protected thousands. Not the hero of dramatic moments, but the quiet architect of countless safe returns. Harry started dinner while Alice set the table, the two of them moving in the comfortable rhythm of people who had learned each other's patterns. The pasta came together the way it always did, garlic and olive oil, and the particular magic of heat applied to simple ingredients. They ate together as the night fell outside, talking about Alice's speech and Harry's work and all the small details of days spent apart. The food was good, the conversation was easy, and beneath it all ran the current of everything they had survived, everything they had built, everything they had become. After dinner, Harold washed dishes while Alice finished homework at the table. The apartment was quiet except for the scratch of her pencil and the splash of butter in the sink. "Dad," Alice's voice came from behind him. "Yeah, I love you." The words were simple, unremarkable, the kind of thing parents and children said to each other all the time. But standing at the sink with his hands in warm water, Harry felt them land in his chest like something sacred. "I love you too, Alice, more than anything." She went back to her homework. He went back to the dishes, and the evening continued its quiet descent toward night. Later, when Alice had gone to bed and the apartment was dark except for the light over the kitchen sink, Harry stood at the window and looked out at the city. Cleveland spread before him, a tapestry of lights and shadows of lives being lived in countless ways. Somewhere out there, families were sitting down to dinner. Workers were finishing late shifts. Children were being tucked into beds by parents who had made it home safe. Some of those safe returns were because of him, because of the protocols he had written, the inspections he had conducted, the training sessions he had led. He would never meet most of the people he had protected, would never know their names or their stories or the children they were raising. But that was okay. Heroism didn't require recognition. It only required showing up day after day and making the choices that mattered. Harry thought about the morning of the fire, about standing on that sidewalk with smoke rising above him and fear clawing at his chest. He had been certain in that moment that he was making a mistake, that running into that building would cost him everything. Instead, it had given him everything. A new career, a new purpose, a daughter who stood up in front of strangers and called him a hero, a life worth living. The city hummed its eternal song below, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in its countless apartments and houses. But Harry had learned that indifference didn't mean insignificance. Every life mattered, every choice counted, every person who went home safe at the end of the day was a victory worth celebrating. He had spent 18 years running toward danger. Now he spent his days preventing it. Different work, same purpose, protecting people, keeping promises, being the kind of man his daughter could be proud of. Harry turned away from the window and walked through the dark apartment toward his bedroom. The door to Alice's room was closed, but he paused outside it for a moment, listening to the silence that meant she was sleeping. His daughter, his responsibility, his greatest achievement, and his deepest fear. She was going to be okay. They both were. The future stretched ahead like a road he couldn't quite see, full of turns and obstacles and moments that would test everything he thought he knew. But Harry had learned something in the past 6 months, something that the fire had burned into his consciousness. The most important things in life aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones you fight for. He had fought for Alice, fought to stay alive, fought to rebuild, fought to become someone worthy of her love and her pride. And he would keep fighting, every day, for as long as it took. Harry Thompson closed his bedroom door and lay down in the darkness, listening to the city breathe outside his window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference. But tonight he was home. His daughter was safe. And somewhere in Cleveland, a woman who had almost died in a fire was probably lying in her own bed thinking about her son, grateful for the second chance she had been given. That was enough. That was more than enough. Harry closed his eyes and let sleep take him, carrying him toward a tomorrow that held more promise than any he had imagined. The fire was behind him, the future was ahead. And in between there was a quiet apartment, a sleeping daughter, and the profound peace of a man who had finally learned to be still.